You ever met someone who seems to be consumed with their pride? Please don't point any fingers. Ever worked with someone who seems to only be humble about the fact that they're the most humble person they know? Ever found yourself taking pride in your humility? This is Proverbs. We are in week 4 of Proverbs. This summer we are reading together as a church family the book of Proverbs. We're just saying, hey, if you would like, the challenge is that one chapter of Proverbs a day according to the date on the calendar. And so today would be chapter 27. If you're following along, we're just going to read through that all summer. But today we're specifically looking at Proverbs chapter 16. We're kind of hitting the main themes of the book of Proverbs as we read it throughout the summer. We've defined wisdom as the right thing, doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason. And that's our prayer as a congregation. That's our prayer as followers of Christ, is that God would give us wisdom. And today's challenge is the issue of pride versus humility. Really, this is a discussion that anyone at any table at any time in our world needs to have. According to the Wall Street Journal, there's a new fad among top-level business executives. The new fad is actually called humility. There's an article titled "The Case for Humble Executives," where it explores the business benefits of the once unpopular leadership virtue. This article particularly says that among executives, humility is the new flavor du jour, which is basically saying everybody's suddenly starting to embrace it. They're kind of excited and prideful about their own humility. Humility is when an executive listens well and admits mistakes and shares the limelight. And in fact, people say the servant leadership model promotes collaboration. And of course, there's one major problem, the article says, is the major problem with humble pie is you actually have to become humble. Apparently, fake abounds. Did you know this? Like the former lieutenant of Krispy Kreme. According to one observer, he took the limelight. He didn't understand the humility part of acting humble. After everyone discovered he was merely faking humility to get ahead in business, the Krispy Kreme board fired him. And as one business expert noted, if you have to act humble, it won't work. You either are or you aren't. And that's what we find out about life over and over again, right? I mean, there's a tension, isn't there? There's a tension to our lives. We're supposed to try to be humble or act humble, even when we're learning that we know that we're learning how to be daily, how to be humble. We've got to actually take pride in what we do while being humble about who we are. And that's the tension, no matter who you are. In fact, I read this week for, the theologian Leonardo DiCaprio. When he said it about this, he said, as soon as enough people give you enough compliments and you're wielding more power than you've ever had in your life, it's not that you become arrogant or you become rude to people, but you get a false sense of your own importance and what you've accomplished. You actually think you've altered the course of history. Now that was a big leap, wasn't it? Did you notice it? A little frustrated with people, not real rude, a little false sense of importance, and suddenly you alter the course of history. And that's the sneaky thing about pride, is it not? The aging person struggles with ego when he becomes indignant that a new generation is passing him by and cares little about what he's done or what he thinks. The midlife person does battle with ego each time he or she compares life with the ways others are living at the same age. A young adult is dealing with pride and ego when she assumes that nothing or no one is ever good enough for her. Like, this is the story, the fall of mankind, is it not? And this is the battle that every one of us face, like no matter who you are. And pride comes at us in all kinds of different ways. It comes up in obvious ways and not so obvious ways. It comes up in public ways, and it comes up in private ways. It comes up in just everyday life. It comes up in unique circumstances, like riding a bull at a local town fair. Anybody ever ridden a mechanical bull? This is a vehicle to humility. Unless maybe you grew up just being a cowboy, then maybe, or cowgirl, maybe that's not the case. I read this week where one pastor said that he was at an open-air street fair when he spotted a mechanical bull that tries to obviously buck people off. And the guy operating the bull said to the pastor, hey, watching it isn't nearly as fun as riding it. So he said, I told the bull operator that I wanted to ride. And he took one look at my middle-aged body and asked, "Are you sure?" And of course, he said that guaranteed that I would not back down. He began to explain to me, he writes, that the bull has 12 levels of difficulty. It might not be easy, he said, but the key is you got to stay centered on the bull. You have to follow the bull. You have to shift your center of gravity as the bull begins to move. And so he writes, I got on the bull, and it started slowly, and then it started moving faster and a little faster, and my body started jostling around from one place to the other. I was holding on as tight as I could, and I remembered his advice. So I began to loosen up. I began to keep moving faster and jolting and bucking and jumping, and I was hanging on sideways. My arms were flailing all around the place. I just hung on, and finally the bull slowed down, and it stopped, and I was still on the bull. It wasn't pretty, but I made it. I imagined how surprised the operator of the bull would be that I had triumphed. So as I began to walk off the mechanical bull and off the mat and over by him, I looked at him in all my pride, and he looked over at me, shaking his head, smiling, and then said, "Nice job. I left it on level 1. And that's the tough thing about life, is it not? About the time that we think we've got it licked, about the time that we think we've got this thing figured out, about the time that we've wrestled with pride and humility, about the time that we're prideful in our humility, then God in his graciousness allows us to learn one more time. In fact, that's where we pick up in Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs chapter 16 is going to remind us over and over again in different challenges and different both instructions and incentives that really pride is our greatest enemy in life and humility is our greatest friend. And so let me give us this morning, if you're taking notes, let me give you 2 truths about pride, 2 truths about humility, and then maybe a challenge at the end. Number 1, about pride, here's a truth about pride. When we walk in pride, we walk in opposition to God. Look at Proverbs chapter 16, verse 5. If you're there, Proverbs 16, verse 5, will you say, I got it? Thank you. I was waiting. There you go. The Lord detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they will not go unpunished. Boy, that is a dose of warning for us in Proverbs chapter 16, is it not? The reminder from Proverbs is that this really humbling truth is that everyone who is proud in heart, some translations say, is actually an abomination to the Lord. Actually, opposition to God. And that person will not go unpunished. Proverbs is reminding us that pride is a very, very awful, ugly thing. It's an abomination to God. It makes his stomach turn. Pride is characterized by an exaggerated desire to win the notice or praise of others. It's an arrogant, haughty estimation of oneself in relation to others. It involves taking the superior position that largely disregards the concerns or opinions or desires of other people. In essence, it's an attempt to claim for oneself the glory that rightly belongs to whom? To God. To God. So when we choose pride over humility, we're choosing ourselves over God. The proud person's focus is not on God, but on self. The world begins to revolve around the prideful person. He or she sets himself or herself above others. And the proud person occupies a place that rightly then belongs to God. And so the scripture makes it clear here in Proverbs chapter 16 that God opposes the proud, that's an abomination to him. And so we shouldn't think this morning that pride is a little character flaw that you need to deal with every now and then. It's not something we should look at and say, hey, it's not that big a deal. I've got, at least a little less pride than the other person that you can find to compare yourself to. It's never good to be struggling and positioning ourselves in our lives and being full of pride. C.S. Lewis once wrote this. He said, pride leads to every other vice. It's the complete anti-God state of mind. So that's what it looks like when we embrace pride. We're actually in an anti-God state of mind. It's another way to actually remind us what Proverbs chapter 16 says about pride. Pride is the thing that God hates. It's like saying to God with haughty eyes, I know better than you, and I don't need you. I've got this figured out. I can do this on my own. That's what pride tempts us to be like, and the attitude and the posture of our heart. Listen to another chapter in Proverbs when it says this, the Lord will tear down the house of the proud, but he will establish the boundary of the widow. Now, isn't that interesting? It's interesting. It's saying the Lord is very well understanding of those who are choosing pride over God. And then it gives an opposite example of someone who's walking in humility, which would be a widow. Pride versus humility. And you can find this all throughout the book of Proverbs, can't we? For those of us who are reading one chapter a day to keep the foolishness away. In the book of Proverbs, we're reminded over and over again about this battle, this real challenge that we have in life. Pride versus humility. Can you think of a most recent time in your mind in which you actually battled pride over humility? Maybe it was something that someone said to you, and it could have been truthful or it could have not been truthful, but you wrestled with the tension of your heart of how you were going to treat them, how you're going to respond to them. Maybe it was something at work that happened and you didn't actually think that was the right thing, or maybe a superior, supervisor, or a boss chose something or a situation maybe over what you would have done, or maybe something at home. And it was something so simple, right? So simple, and suddenly you found yourself walking in an attitude of pride rather than humility. During the Great Awakening, when the Spirit of God revived much of our nation's early faith, Jonathan Edwards was presiding over a massive prayer meeting. There were 800 men praying with him. And into that meeting, a woman sent a message asking the men to pray for her husband. The note described a man who had become unloving, prideful, and extremely difficult. Edwards read the message in private and then thinking perhaps that the man described was actually present in the prayer meeting, he made a bold request. Edwards read the note out loud to the 800 men. And then he asked the man who was described to raise his hand in front of the whole assembly so they could pray with this man. And 300 men raised their hand. Pride is an anti-God state of mind. And it actually takes humility to admit that you're full of pride. What are some symptoms of pride? Here's a couple that we found that we can actually suggest and maybe check our own hearts this morning about maybe issues or areas in which we may be wrestling with pride. Here's a few examples of when you know that you're really giving into pride rather than humility. Fault finding. Fault finding. When you're living in pride, you just find yourself really easy to find fault with everyone and everything else. Here's another one. B, harsh spirit. Those who have a sickness of pride in their hearts speak of others' sins with contempt and irritation and frustration and judgment, but very rarely do they acknowledge their own sin or failures. Here's another one. C, superficiality. That when you're led with a heart of pride, you can have great success in the areas of holiness that are highly visible and accountable to others, but privately you have very little discipline in your life. What about defensiveness? That's another symptom of pride. True humility is not knocked off balance and thrown into a defensive posture by challenge or rebuke, but instead continues in doing good and entrusting the soul to a faithful Creator. Defensiveness, right? You find yourself saying things like, I'm not being defensive, right? Am I the only one that's ever done that? Like in the last few weeks? No, maybe not. I've definitely found myself in that one. What about presumption before God? Humility approaches God with humble assurance in Christ. And that's what it looks like to be humble, to say, God, I know that you're going to teach me. God, I know that you want good things for me. God, I know that you're going to sanctify me. God, I know even this trying time is going to help me grow in Christ. Rather than presumption before God, God, how dare you? God, I can't believe God, you let me down. God, how come you didn't? That's presumption before God. Here's another one. Desperation for attention. Pride is hungry for attention. It sounds like shameless boasting about ourselves. Maybe it's been unable to say no to anyone because we need to be needed. Maybe it looks like obsessively thirsting for certain relationships, or certain relationships to always be better than what they are, and never being satisfied or content for those people or those relationships. Lastly, here's another one, symptom of pride: neglecting others. Pride prefers some people over others. It honors those who the world deems worthy of honor, giving more weight to their words or their wants or their needs, never looking out for those who maybe feel least or last or lonely. Why does pride do this? Because pride is our greatest enemy, while humility is our greatest friend. Here's the second thing about pride. If you're taking notes, pride reaps awful consequences. It reaps awful consequences. We could actually probably take the microphone this morning and pass it around, and every one of us could give an example of either in your own life or someone else's life that's then spilled out on your life, and the pride that they embraced or said yes to actually reaps consequences in your own life. Listen to Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2, that actually talks about this. It says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2 actually talks about this word pride, and it gives this picture in the original language of boiling up. Boiling up. Recently, this is an embarrassing story to tell on myself. I know that some of you will be really disappointed in me. But recently, I was actually cooking, as you say cooking, boiling green beans. Yeah, I know. It's really sad that I actually didn't know how to do that. And I was actually boiling green beans, and instead of being just honest with other people to say, I actually don't know how to boil, how long do you do that? And then I actually finally reached out to one person. Their advice was really helpful. Hey, go to YouTube. Thank you. You know what that means? Basically, I don't want to help you do what everybody obviously does in this world now. Go to YouTube. But I boiled these green beans, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great. I boiled them for like 7 or 8 minutes. It's going to be wonderful. And no need to even really try them to see if they're ready, because it's going to be fantastic. And then, of course, my family was kind enough and gracious enough to, grin and bear it and get through. And suddenly they were really hungry for the main course and not for the green beans. And the reality was, when I found out, was it actually takes maybe 30 minutes or 45 minutes, or even could take an hour or even longer to really taste like the other green beans that I've tasted, like my wife's green beans that are so good. Why? It's a boiling up. It takes longer. And the problem is, pride is like that, where it just continues, boils and boils and boils and boils. In fact, Luke chapter 14, Jesus teaches a parable that captures what the dishonor or pride looks like. He says this in chapter 14. And he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they'd been picking out the places of honor at the table. And he said, when you're invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both shall come and say to you, give place to this man. And then in disgrace, you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you're invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. What's that a picture of? That's actually a picture of followers of Christ saying, instead of embracing pride, we're going to make our life about embracing what? Humility. And we're going to spend our lives finding ways in which, instead of rushing to the front and being first, we're going to actually find ways to be okay with being last. It's actually a portrait of what heaven looks like. For those who've spent all their lives being anti-God and placing themselves first, well, they'll eventually, what did Jesus say? They'll be last. But those who've actually humbled themselves and thought less of themselves, or spent more time thinking of others and less time thinking about themselves, they'll what? They'll be last in this life, and when they get to heaven, they'll be what? It'll be first. And so all eternity will be this great exchange of those who either said, I'm going to live this life with pride, and I'm going to spend all of eternity being humbled by God, or I'm going to spend this life embracing humility, and by God's grace, God will promote me for all eternity. What would it look like for each one of us today to say no to pride? What would you have to do different? What would you have to say different? How would you have to change today? Who would you need to talk to? What would you need to acknowledge or admit? How would things need to change this week? Look back at Proverbs chapter 16, and now let's look at verse 18 about pride. Pride, many of you know this verse by heart. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. In the prophets, impending destruction was often foretelling of a nation in rebellion against God. If that nation didn't turn from its rebellion, it was the ultimate sign of pride, that God would bring destruction through conquering armies or famine. God may bring circumstances also into our own very lives in which we deal with pride. But more often than not, the destruction we face is a result of the natural consequences of pride. A married couple could be too proud to admit that their marriage is struggling, and so they don't get help when they could still get help. A friendship explodes because one of the individual's pride keeps her or him from admitting their mistakes and asking for forgiveness, and the friendship ends. A business person, because of pride, refuses to receive counsel and recklessly pursues a course of action that takes the company under. Pride cuts off life-giving relationships. Pride keeps people from getting help. Pride goes before destruction. This is why the Proverbs is reminding us all throughout the Proverbs. Listen, if you want to embrace a life of wisdom, doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason, then embrace humility rather than pride, because pride is the first chapter of the book called Failure. And this is what the writers of Proverbs is reminding us, that pride is our greatest enemy and humility is our greatest friend. I read this week of G.K. Chesterton telling a parable about a young boy who was given a choice of pride versus humility. The choice he was given as a little boy was he could be gigantic or he could be minuscule. The boy made the choice, he writes, that almost any little boy would make. He chose to be gigantic, really gigantic. He's a retelling, the retelling of G.K. Chesterton's parable goes like this. His head brushed the clouds. He waded the Atlantic like a pond. He scooped gray whales into his hand and swished them like tadpoles in the bowl of his palm. He strode in a few bounds from one edge of the continent to the other. He kicked over a range of mountains like an anthill just because he could, and he didn't feel like stepping over it. He plucked a California redwood and whittled its tip to use as a toothpick. And when he got tired, he stretched out across Nebraska and Ohio, flopping one arm into the Dakotas and the other into Canada, and slept in the grass. It was magnificent. It was spellbinding. It was exhilarating for about one day. And then it was boring. And the gigantic boy, in his boredom, daydreamed about having made the other choice, to be minuscule. His backyard would have become an Amazon rainforest. His gerbil would hawk larger than a woolly mammoth, and he could ride the back of a butterfly or go spelunking down wormholes over and over and over again. Even minuscule, a tub of ice cream would have been a winter playground of magic proportions. Life, he said, would have been much more interesting had he chosen smallness. See, this is the challenge of pride versus humility. What are we going to do with our lives? Are we going to try ultimately to be gigantic, to make ourselves bigger and bigger and bigger? Or are we going to embrace humility and be willing to even allow ourselves to be smaller, smaller, smaller? Here's two truths about humility. First one is this: when we choose humility, we walk in alignment with God. So pride, remember, pride said we are living in opposition with God. When we choose humility, we're walking in alignment with God. Listen to Proverbs chapter 8. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance are the evil way, and the perverted mouth I hate. Pride and arrogance are evil. Pride and arrogance are evil. Say it with me. Pride and arrogance are evil. It's not a little bad habit. It's actually evil. And over again, the scripture says, listen, if you're going to walk in wisdom, if we're going to walk in wisdom, if we're going to make the right choice at the right time for the right reason, then we've got to embrace humility. We've got to ask the Spirit of God to make us humble. And that's a dangerous prayer, is it not? Lord, make us humble. Humility is characterized by accurate self-appraisal, responsiveness to the opinion of others, a willingness to give praise to others before claiming it for yourself. The humble person accepts his or her imperfections and sins and failures and mistakes and acknowledges the gifts and the abilities and the achievements that have come from God. Humility is not self-negation or the rejection of all our God-given strengths and abilities. Humility involves a grateful dependence on God and a realistic appraisal of both our strengths and our weaknesses. Tim Keller once wrote, humility is so shy that as soon as you begin talking about it, it leaves the room. We need more humility. Humility, secondly, bears satisfying fruit rather than unwanted consequences. Listen to Proverbs chapter 29. A man's pride will bring him, anybody want to guess? Low. But a humble spirit will obtain honor. Listen to Proverbs chapter 22. The reward of humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and life. Did you hear that? I'll read it again. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 4. The reward of humility and fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and life. Now, in Israelite society, wealth was considered a blessing from God. In terms of riches, we need to be careful not to push what this proverb is saying, not to actually believe that somehow in the 21st century that if you chose humility, it meant that, that you would have nice cars and a big house and cool vacays and college scholarships. That's not what the Old Testament passage is promising here. But everyone knew in the Old Testament that prosperity and riches weren't just some economic blessing. Everyone knew that to be prosperous in life, it meant that you would have things like richer, deeper relationships. That if you were going to prosper in life, it meant you would have lifelong memories. It meant that if you were prosperous in life, if you were going to have riches and honor in life, you would actually look around you and you'd start to realize that the community of people around you are growing in health in their lives. That you would actually have riches in this world would actually mean that you would have work that you actually saw reward for and enjoyed. How many times have we seen people who were rich economically but hated their lives and their job? The Israelites knew, that's not what it looks like to prosper. What it looks like to prosper is actually to gain reward from your work and enjoy your work. What it meant to be prosperous in Israelite culture meant that you would actually have neighbors. You would know your neighbors, and you would eat with your neighbors. It's the better life. It's the reward for humility. This is what it looks like to have your life in alignment with God. So today we have this choice. We can either choose pride, which is our greatest enemy, or we can choose humility, which can be our greatest friend. So here's a few questions as we close. This past few weeks, number one, these past few weeks, whose sin have you been most focused upon? Other people's sin? or your own. If you spend all your time only talking about, thinking about, pondering on the sin of others, and you never reflect on your own areas in which you must grow, then you could be embracing pride rather than humility. Number two, what's the focus of your joy, security, and contentment? What's the focus? Is it the world? Is it your circumstances? Is it something that happened a few months ago, a few years ago, a few decades ago? Or is it Christ? Is it His Word? Is it the purpose that He's given you? And number three, who is the focus of your service? When you think about where you spend your time and how you serve and where you use your gifts and talents and abilities, how you handle your finances, and all of that, is that focus on how you want it and how you want to use it and how you can control it, or is it actually for the service of others? We've got a challenge before us. We've got a decision to make, and that decision, it happens every day, doesn't it? Choose pride. We'll find out that it's ultimately our greatest enemy. Or we can choose by the Spirit of God, by the grace of God, with the Spirit's leadership, we can choose humility. And humility can become our greatest friend. May that be true of us. Amen? Let's stand for prayer.